Hello, all, and welcome to our first Ask Me Anything session from Extreme Genes and our Extreme Genes Patrons Club. And I can't tell you how excited I am to have you guys. This is new technology for me. I'm an old radio guy, but it's a lot of fun to do the live streaming, and I hope everything works out technically and all that. The idea of this is going to be very simply to give you a chance to ask me anything or my guests anything. And speaking of our guests, we have our very first one here. Of course, it's an easy one. My good friend David Allen Lambert, the chief genealogist of the New England Historic Genealogical Society and AmericanAncestors.org. Where are you, David?
Hold on, let me check my wallet.
You're not at home. I can tell this is a hotel room.
It is Louisville, Kentucky.
Louisville. And what are you doing?
I am on about 4 committees for the Sons of the American Revolution, and we have a leadership conference twice a year, once in March and then in September. And I'm down here for the meetings.
Very fun. I love the hat, by the way. There's a story there, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's my Scully cap that I bought in Scotland.
Right, and you were there over the summer. No, we didn't want to see that. We really didn't want to see that.
You have to keep it family oriented. Nobody needs to see my kneecap.
No. We don't really know what's going on below here right now. And I think that's probably the best. We'll leave it to anybody's imagination. Exactly. Anyway, so we want to give anybody a chance to follow along and ask any question you like. We'd be happy to share that. In the meantime, I thought, we'd get started. First of all, I gotta call out Eddie Donlin. He is one of our very early patron club members, and he texted just before we started. He said, "Hey, I don't know if I can make it till 11." And I know, on the east side of the country, it's very late. I understand. So he said, "But anyway, you guys rock, have fun." I'm like, "Eddie, you can make it. You can do it." And I have not heard back from him since. So.
You fell asleep already?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. I will say this though, and I'm sorry, Eddie, that it is so late. I'm going to throw David under the bus completely because, you've been out doing your thing, and so we really couldn't do it any earlier than this. And I wanted to make sure we got our first Ask Me Anything session in before the end of the month, and keeping with our commitment to our Patrons Club members. So to everybody following along, thank you so much for being here. I thought maybe, David, we would start our first session just talking about how we got into genealogy and some of the things we've learned along the way. Because you started even earlier than I did. I mean, most folks don't start, I think the overwhelming majority till much later in life when people are gone and they miss them and they want to know more about their lives that they never got the chance to ask them. And I think we all have lots of folks we just missed or didn't ask and we wanted to know, but you got started at age 7.
Yeah. My paternal grandmother died when I was 6. She was killed, unfortunately, in an auto accident. So I really didn't know her, didn't know my grandfathers. And so one day when I was 7, I was home from school, and my maternal grandmother, who lived with us, had a book, and she handed it over to me, and in it was a metal tintype photograph, hand-colored, and I asked my 80-year-old grandmother, I said, "Nana, who's this?" She said, "This is my dad." Well, for a 7-year-old, the idea that my 80-year-old grandmother could have been a child, let alone, age people, I hadn't seen much in the line of death. I'm like, "Well, where does he live?" Well, he died in 1921, and,
wow.
She told me, showed me in the book where her parents were and where her older siblings. I said, "Nana, you're not in there." And she goes, "Well, I wasn't born yet." Could have ended there. But then she said, "By the way, my dad was on a whaling ship." Well, no pun intended, but I was hooked. And because of that, I'm doing genealogy for the last 41 years.
Yeah, you were
trying to add stories like that, because that's the most important thing. Names and dates are nice, they fill in charts, but it's the stories.
Well, the charts is really the skeleton, to the meat of the whole thing. But you got going with NEHGS when you were in your teens, right?
Yeah, I was 17 years old when I finally was allowed to join. I was 13.
By them or by your parents?
Right. My parents were with me when I went when I was 13, and they said, "You need a parent or guardian." I said, "But they're not interested in genealogy. I am." And by the time I was 17, I was their youngest member. It's funny because we have staff that weren't even born when I first came there as a member, and they'll pull up, look at this article from 1987, the junior member of NEHCS interview with David Allen Lambert. I'm like, oh gosh, another one. I almost want to deface that copy of the magazine and like put in like an ad or something instead of my interview and just hide that page. But it's fun. It's fun.
It
I've
is.
been
By the
doing
way,
that for 24 years.
good news here. Eddie stayed awake. He shouted back. So he's Eddie. Good to
All
have
right.
you here. He's saying, "Hey, Fish and David." Steve Southwick's in there. Hi guys. How are
Hey.
you, Steve? Nice to have you. Thank you very much. Any questions? Just feel free to pop in and share them, and we'll take our best crack at it. Remember, it is ask me anything or ask us anything. That doesn't mean we can answer anything, but we'll give it our best shot. But we do have expert guests, people we can get to, and sincerely, we're happy to find out for you about some things, and happy to share contact information because you've been good enough to trust in us to join the Patrons Club. So we thank you very much for that. I started, David, in my mid-20s. I had just gotten married. I was 26. And by the time I was 21, I had lost my dad, my brother, 2 uncles, and all my grandparents.
Wow.
And yeah, so that all that was really left was a half sister, my brother, and my mom and me. And at 26, I met Julie, and we got married, and we started our family. And that was the point where it's just like, well, who were all those people, that I knew earlier in my life? What were their stories? My brother was 21. He had complications of Hodgkin's disease. And so we lost him early, and I was only 8 years old. And we were very close when I was little, but at this point, there's just so little to recall about him. So did a lot of research at that time, got started, and I remember the first time I visited the Salt Lake City Family History Library, which is the largest in the world. If you've never been there, you really need to treat yourself at least once in your life.
Absolutely,
it's incredible, and they had these thick binders.
And I remember those.
And I opened these binders, and people had their lines in there going back forever. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I want mine to look like that. And that was kind of the incentive. And at this point, I will say that has happened. But one of the things that I should mention is over time, I developed some abilities that I didn't realize that you could do. For instance, 8 years in, I had hit my brick wall with my second great grandfather, Robert Fisher, and I couldn't get any further. And I knew that I had found every record that I could find. And this was really before the internet. I mean, the internet was there, but it wasn't a factor in genealogy at the time.
Sure.
And so I made that decision that, okay, well, I've gone as far back as I can. He was the immigrant. Why don't I start just finding out what happened? What became of his family as a whole, all the descendants? So I started doing what Maureen Taylor and I talked about recently on one of the bonus podcasts for the Patrons Club. That was reverse genealogy, and that's pulling it all forward. I had no idea the benefit of that when I started it. It was just mostly to put together this tree of descendants, see if I could learn a few things, a few stories. But what happened is when I finally came forward enough and I hit pay dirt, and I started finding living relatives. And it was kind of exciting. Like, oh my gosh, a living third cousin. I talked to this very senior woman down in Albuquerque, and she had been a granddaughter of a gal who had overlapped my great-great-grandparents' lives, and I thought she might know where in England he had come from. Common name, Robert Fisher, England,
oh, sure.
All this. And so she said, oh, I wish I had asked Grandma that. I'm like, oh, God. But she says, but I have a cousin who lives in upstate New York, and she has a son who's about your age, and he's really into this. Maybe he can help you. So I got on that, and wouldn't you know, he had a note left by his great grandmother, and it had the answer where he was from. And then other people had material. Oh, look at this. This came from one of these descendants that I tracked down. This is my great uncle in the Civil War. And they were so happy to find people who were interested. They give me this stuff. It was phenomenal. So
genealogical gold mine.
Genealogical gold mine. All right, this is a real problem. I got a mosquito in here. This is going to
I'm
drive me
afraid of the
nuts.
mosquito.
I don't know. Anyway, Eddie's got a question for us. He says, how do you persuade people to go sideways? Everybody thinks I'm nuts when I say going sideways will get you up the tree faster. So what's your answer to that, David? I think by sideways, he's probably talking about what I'm talking about right now. Yes?
Researching all the collateral siblings and all that, the sideways
Yeah.
into all the other branches. I mean, I always like to think that if you convince people to research that way, the more likelihood of finding pictures like you did
Yeah.
or your relative. I mean, if you work on your own direct line, you don't have living people, you need to outbranch like that. I've been doing that for over 30 years. As soon as I have a distant cousin, I reach out. Give you an example. Recently, I had a match on my autosomal DNA. Turns out this person and I shared a set of fourth great grandparents, and yeah, I didn't think much of it, but I reached out to her because she lived in New Brunswick, Canada. Now, for me and my family, I have pictures of 5 of my great grandparents and 1 of my great great grandparents, and that's it. This person had 2 ambrotypes taken in 1855 or before of my 4th great grandparents, born in the 1780s, and to me, tears were rolling down my eyes because I'd never seen pictures of anybody on that generation that far back. And it just goes to show you, you never know. And it was 1 drop of saliva that matched me up with somebody that I still have some remnant of this ancestor and his wife in my DNA. If it had gone to my daughter's level, there's no match with this person.
All right, I'm going to assign my son Steve is here. He's kind of helping us produce today. Steve, go in the other room. Bring in Robert. Would you?
All right. The whole thing?
Yes, the big Robert portrait.
Oh, thank goodness! I thought you were going to bring in a
No. No, this was amazing. This was, we talked about tracking down people. Back then, it was really the only way you come forward. I think part of the problem, Eddie, that we have right now is that we're so spoiled by internet finds. Oh, well, we're connected to this person. You can drop them a note if you're so inclined. And a lot of people don't even respond. What I liked about it back in the day. All right, wait, Steve, take it, hold it back there. Look at this, Eddie. Hold it where we can see it carefully. Let me see if I can get a full screen shot of this here. There we go. There you go. This was given to me. If you want an answer about why you want people to go sideways and track down other descendants, this was given to me by a 3rd cousin in Minnesota. And I have no family knowledge of anybody in Minnesota, but I tracked these people down in 1990. He said, you're not going to believe what I have. And he says, you've got to have this because this is your name line. That's my 2nd great grandfather, Robert. And this is a pastel that was done from a photograph of him in probably in the 1860s, and probably the pastel was actually done. Let me see, get that reflection off. The pastel was probably done shortly after he died in late 1875. So that thing hangs on my wall in our family room. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate the effort there. So if you talk about something that's absolutely unbelievable, that to me was worth everything as far as tracking down other descendants. You can't do that just by, little email blips. You need to establish a relationship with people. And if folks see that you have become the genealogist of the family, they give you stuff. And I've started a collection of some of these things, and I keep them in acid-free books. And I'm sure you do much of the same, David. And I keep these pages. So this is a shot, by the way, of one haul that I had in 2014 from a guy who was a 3rd cousin in California. And he passed, and it included in there the family Bible. I mean, I can't believe these pages that go back to the 1840s. So I think it's frankly the most valuable strategy that nobody ever talks about. And since we're all pretty familiar with the idea that what was I going to say? I completely spaced out. But I think we all have this idea in our mind that everything's done online, but we don't realize or recognize the fact that there's probably more stuff in people's attics and basements and in drawers and cabinets than there even is online, especially the stuff we really want, you know, documents, photographs, heirlooms.
Well, I can tell you with my own wife's grandmother, I knew that she had all the photos because I had looked at them for probably a good 15 years before she died, after I first met her and got married to her granddaughter, my wife. And I knew they were in jeopardy. And my wife's uncle wasn't interested in them. My wife's mother was in the other part of the country. So when the grandmother died, I went back up to Maine and rescued a suitcase full of photographs dating back to the 1850s of my wife's family. And I have them now. And in one drawer, because we were going through all of her stuff, I found all the letters she wrote while she was in the Coast Guard in World War II to her husband, who was in the Coast Guard in World
Oh,
War II. Back and forth letters, over
wow.
80 of them. And it would have been tossed out because the son didn't care. He said, that's past.
Yeah.
Past should be the past. I'm like, well, the past is my future for my children. He didn't have any kids. And it's, it was a wonderful addition to the genealogy on my wife's side. And she had
Totally.
so many pictures.
Isn't that a joy when that happens? Eddie says he was given a photo from I don't know. Eddie keeps going back. Third grade, third cousin. Wait a minute, wait a second time. Okay, one of Eddie's cousins. He says he was given a photo album from a third cousin with a photo of his second times great cousin or something. Anyway, he was just thrilled, and it also had a cemetery deed from 1878.
Ooh.
And she gave it to him. So congrats, Eddie. That is a great thing. And that's another example of exactly what we're talking about. Steve is asking us, Steve Southwick, do you guys have opinions on which DNA tests are best and which should I do first? You want to take that first? Because I've got some thoughts.
Yeah, it really depends, Steve, what you're trying to do. I mean, for me, my Lambert family's from Ireland. I don't know where in Ireland they come from, so then I could do an autosomal test, but I'm only looking at a small fragment. As you know, autosomal is good, and jump in here, fish. I'd say to your fourth or fifth great grandparents, because by then you're getting so little of the DNA. Half from your parents.
Well, the matches get, since you get different pieces, you don't match even if you're related. That's the thing.
It's really a dumb luck. So I would do Y DNA for my direct male line.
Yeah.
For maternal, obviously mitochondrial DNA. If you're just trying to determine, where your ancestors came geographically from thousands of years ago, that's where an autosomal test comes in. And I'm sure that you've done lots of these fish for all sides of your family. What have you found most beneficial for matches?
Well, it depends what you're trying to do. I was trying to prove that a fifth grade recently was a bloodline or not a bloodline relative in this particular family. So I tracked down a third cousin who I didn't know until just a few years ago. And he's been very interested and excited and engaged. And I bought him a Y-DNA kit and he took the test. And we were able to prove that this common ancestor was indeed from that bloodline. So that was very beneficial. I think the big thing about DNA tests, Steve, is that you want to test, because there is expense involved, obviously. The thing you want to do is you want to test the oldest people in your family first. And there are a couple of reasons for it. The first is that the oldest person is another generation back. And so they're more likely to share some other possible matches that you might not. Okay, so recently we did that with my wife's uncle and her mother. In fact, I've talked to one DNA expert recently, and he hasn't even done his at all because he wanted to do his older folks first, the uncles and the aunts and all these people. And so that's one thing. The other reason that you want to do that one right away is, of course, you want to find as many matches as you can right now and reach out to those folks and maybe have some experiences like we have. I think the one thing that's underutilized when you're dealing with matches is actually trying to make a personal connection, not just a, hey, we're related, to really have phone conversations or maybe even a Skype conversation. See what they got. And find out, one thing when I started this whole thing, and I told you about the reverse genealogy, and I just showed you the fruits of that. Eddie talked about the fruits of his labors with that. is that as you know gather these things, you have more to share with other people, and more people come back to you, and so that really has everything to do with it. All right, we have another question here. Let's see, Adam. Oh, okay. Adam says I matched DNA with someone who's a first or second cousin. She has no tree and is private, and she's a movie star. Oh, fantastic. We have 614 centimorgans shared across 27 DNA segments. Pretty close.
Oh, that is close.
Yeah, that sounds like what, first cousin once removed or something. If we are that close, how far up to the grandparents are possible? Should I find her within first grandparents? First of all, if you're doing it, say on Ancestry, if you click see who you match to who they match, that might give you an idea right there.
Yeah.
That's really important.
The other thing, it's quite possible that it could be a further generation. I'll give you an example. I recently heard from someone that was a match as a second cousin, but it was sharing only one of my grandparents who had a child with another person. So they come up as a false match as a second cousin. So it could be your grandparent or it could be your great grandparent. So
yeah.
Knowing their tree, I mean, that would be the one thing. I mean, I know they're a movie star, but obviously they tested their DNA unless somebody stole their DNA and did a test for them without them knowing.
Yeah.
So I would think that if you are direct with them, say that we're a close match, where either your grandparents or great grandparents were related somewhat closely, let's look at a tree and send them your tree first as a goodwill gesture and say, does this look familiar to any, or better yet, just any of these surnames look familiar to you?
Sure, that makes sense. I was just trying to find, by the way, Blaine Bettinger. Steve has or Adam has a terrific chart available online, and I'll have to find it and see if I can't share that with you. And it talks about how many centimorgans is common to what relationship. However, I will tell you this. I've been recently helping a friend of mine. He's in his 50s. He's never been able to identify his birth father. And we had a match with a woman who was dead on for a first cousin and 880 centimorgans. And so we were assuming that, but that created a problem because that would have made my friend's father like 25 years older than his mother. That just didn't seem to fit. So I reached out to this DNA expert. You may know him from Extreme Genes, Paul Woodbury. We have him on the show quite a bit. He's from legacytree.com. And Paul said, well, over how many segments was it? That was a difference because every generation up and back down gives another chance for segments to divide. So you get more as you get further out, and then it contracts again as you share less and less DNA. He determined that this first cousin that I thought it was actually a half aunt. And yes, so now we're DNA testing my friend's siblings. They've agreed to do it to help out because we think we know who their parents are or father is supposed to be. So we should get some results on that soon. So these things, can really make a difference. Steve, you were asking how do you reach out? Well, obviously in this day and age, you do start with contacting them through the site, whether it's through MyHeritage or Ancestry or wherever it is you are. But another thing I do is I try to figure out who they are and go to whitepages.com and see if I can actually get a phone number and put a phone call into them or get an address and write them a letter. Now, letters were made back in the old days with a piece of blank paper and you write them a note. Yeah, I know. And a stamp. And you put this stamp on it and you put it in the mailbox. I'll tell you, it used to be waiting for the mail to show up was the greatest thing. I mean, it was always so exciting. You open that box, anything in there, there's that letter. And sometimes it's fat and you're going, oh my gosh, somebody wrote a really long letter about, all the information that was in there. But, when you consider that the real keepers of the secrets are the older folks, they aren't necessarily the most technically savvy folks. So, I'll tell you the one secret that I came from, and I kind of skipped over this previously. We're talking about a couple of the things that I learned about, pulling forward. But when you pull forward, I created two separate databases, and maybe you do this, David. If you use something like Roots Magic, I create a direct line tree on there, and so I can just keep track of my direct ancestors and their children and spouses. the
Mm-hmm.
fundamental tree, the skeleton, okay?
Sure.
But I also have a tree where it goes out this way, and like you were talking about, Eddie, going in every direction. And I've pulled it down. So seeing as many of my ancestors were immigrants within the last 200 years, I would create a family tree, and I've written books. A couple of them right here. This is you saw the guy in the big portrait I brought in. This is his descendants. So I wrote the stories of his ancestors and then created, I better go full screen on this, but created the tree in the book, but mostly, let's see, after the stories, there we go. We got pictures. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. And just create a little paragraph or two about all these descendants and kind of keep a little numbering system. I do the first child of the second child of the first child of the first person, that type of thing. So you can go 1.2.5.9.1.2. And it's a nice little system for keeping track of who's who. So I put these books together, and this is something that then I share with all these other people. Now they buy copies. I don't make a lot of money from it. In fact, I don't make any money from it. I just want to cover my costs. But in the process of putting this descendant book together, they're in it. They share a lot of information. They tell me about their cousins, people who don't have an ancestry account or a MyHeritage account or even Family Search. And so you reach out to some of these older folks and you make friends with them. You talk to them. Well, how can I reach that person? You can find, you were talking about pulling forward, Steve, how can you make some contact? How about obituaries? You know, the next of kin as you kind of work this thing forward. So to me, this database coming from the immigrant ancestor forward has been invaluable because it forces me to find, well, where's the family of this one? Where's the family of that one? And then when I reach out to them, the descendants of some of those people, this is where all this stuff comes from. And it's phenomenal. So let's see who else has got a question up here. All right. First of all, Eddie, thank you for staying up so late. I hope you're not missing anything important on TV tonight. So, the next thing I made a mention of here in my notes that I wanted to talk about a little was collecting your ancestors. And I've shown you a lot of the collection. And a big part of that has to do with, obviously, the descendants. But the second aspect to collecting is eBay and other auction sites online. And we have all kinds of ways to collect. In fact, David, I've shown you this before. I found some invoices on eBay recently of my great-grandfather's coffee, tea, and spice importing business in New York City. They had sent some invoices to a company in Pontiac, Michigan. Mm-hmm. And somehow that company's papers survived. And somebody's got them and they're putting them out on eBay. And I wound up buying 3 of them from 1878, 1879, 1881. Another one popped up just today on eBay. And it's like, you know what?
That's the same dealer, isn't
it? It was the same guy. And he was in Houston, which is amazing because he did not get drowned out. He did not get drowned out. So finding people through eBay, there was a dealer also up in Oregon that had one of these things. So that was pretty exciting to me to get those. And, you know, each of my kids may wind up with each of the interested ones anyway. Those are things that can survive. Adam writes, how do we enter and deal with maiden names and married names on Ancestry? Good question, Adam. With the women, you always deal with the maiden names. Otherwise, you're going to have a mess. Want to add to that, David?
Yeah, I mean, I guess suppose it's on 2 sets of records that you're looking for. So say, for instance, if Ancestry has using birth and marriage records, you're going to want to look for the maiden name. But if you're looking for her death record, it may not have the maiden name listed in the death record, or they may have not indexed it. So it depends on what you're looking for specifically. I mean, obviously, after she's married, her maiden name is not going to be in the census, unless, of course, you're dealing with French Canada, because then the maiden names are used. But oftentimes, after they're married, it's the married name, even gravestones. Sometimes the maiden name is not referenced. I mean, I know that a lot of times that's the hardest part of finding the maiden name is because it's not back referenced, especially in the earlier records.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Adam, when you talk about, what do you enter? I mean, I'm thinking you're talking about the idea of what do you put on a chart. As far as searching for it, for instance, Ancestry and others will actually, and MyHeritage too. They will look for it. They say, oh, Mary Smith is married to Joe Johnson, so now they'll look for a death record of Mary Johnson. It's just the way the algorithms work for a lot of these things now. So you don't have to worry about that in your chart. Audrey asks, I'm going to my ancestor's cemetery, but the graves aren't on Find a Grave. How do I find the grave there? That's a good question.
Ooh, genealogy before the internet. Novel idea.
Yes.
Well, Audrey, the way I used to do it, taking into consideration the size of the community, I always would call the public library or get in touch with the town hall and say, who is your genealogist in the community?
Okay.
Because oftentimes they know where the bodies are, even if they're in the backwoods of somebody's farm. They know sometimes because years ago maybe somebody did a card index of the gravestones. They may have a typescript at the Historical Society long before the internet. Because a lot of these cemeteries, it may not be that someone hasn't gone out with Find a Grave or Billion Graves. The gravestone may have been deteriorated or vandalized or broken, and someone may have had a record of it from 50 years ago, where it is, or might know where the family farm is, and they know that they're probably buried on the back part of the farm because there's some people by that surname there. I mean, I know with you, Fish,
Yeah.
I'm sure you've been on adventures looking for your ancestors' last resting places, and sometimes it's not as obvious as just clicking online.
No, it's fun to actually make contact. I like to turn on the charm. It was about 6 or 7 years ago. I had a third grade. I hadn't been able to break through in 30 years. I had names because their names, the father's name and the mother's first name, were on the death record of my second great grandmother. I was stuck there for a long, long, long time. And I had a reason that I was going to go and try to reopen the case again. And that was because digitized newspapers were out now. And as we all know, there's a website. If you have, by the way, if you have New York ancestry and you don't use this site, you're missing so much. It's called fultonhistory.com. And I will say, honestly, it's a rather primitive site. It's run by one guy who retired in his late 40s and just lives his passion, which is digitizing microfilm of old newspapers. And he has personally digitized, as an individual, uh, 3 times what the Library of Congress has done, and mostly about New York City, New York State, and surrounding areas. And he's now starting to branch off, and he's got right around 30,000. I'm sorry, 30 million pages of newspapers in there. The search engine is really challenging. It's not great, but I went on there and I found an obituary that looked like the person I was trying to find. Mentioned the right age, and found out he was buried in a cemetery in Brooklyn, as a lot of New York people are. So I called over to the cemetery because I wanted to know right now, how would I validate it? You know the story, David. I mean, if he's buried with someone with the wife's name, and it was not a common name, his name was Samuel Downs and her name was Olive. So if he's buried with Olive, it's all good.
I want the plot plan. I want to know where all the bodies are.
Yeah, I want to know where all the bodies are. So I called over there, and this gal named, I think her name was Rosalie, and she had this thick Brooklyn accent, and it was just classic. And I called her, and she says, "This is Rosalie. May I help you?" And yes, Rosalie, how nice to meet you. My name is Scott Fisher. I'm calling from all the way across the country. I am trying to find out if my answer, I've been working this for 30 years. I need you, and she's laughing. And so I gave her the basic information. One moment. So she puts me in hold and left me for about 5 minutes and went back to the vault and came in and said, "Okay, I have it here." And I said, "Okay, was he buried with an olive?" She goes, "No, he wasn't." I'm going, and it says, "Well, was he buried with anybody?" "Yes, he was." I mean, it's like 30 questions, and so I said, okay. She says, he was buried with a little girl named Lizzie Moore. Does that name mean anything to you? I mean, this is just exact quotes. I said, well,
Yeah,
maybe,
yeah.
because my great grandmother, before she was with Andrew Fisher, had been married to a Moore, but I wasn't familiar with a child of that name. So I got the information, I researched it, and found out, sure enough, my great grandmother, with her first husband, had had a child named Lizzie. So this man led me to her, and then she validated that he was the right guy. But it wasn't anything that could have been done on the internet. It had to be
Yeah.
done through personal discussion.
And then, of course, the next step is obviously wanting to go to the cemetery. And if you can't get the answer that there's a stone there and you're going to make it on a weekend trip, I always tell the groundskeeper or the cemetery office, can you go and put a wooden stake marker in the ground where that plot is with something tied onto it? That way you can find it. Even if you're paying respects to a plot of grass,
Yeah.
you don't have the frustration of wandering around wondering what plot it is. I mean,
Yeah.
it's, that's a really good thing to try. And then when you go there, maybe find out if you can erect a gravestone. I put gravestones on a couple of my ancestors' last burial places already.
Wow. All right. So Adam's saying, I went as far back as my fourth great grandfather and grandmother on the paternal line. Lineage was mentioned in the baptism record of their son. I was left with Luz Koss and Josepha Koss. Now the trail is dead. At some point, my European heritage jumped to Mexico, and I estimate
Oh,
fourth greats were born in the 1780s. Wow. Well, you do have a journey ahead of you, don't you, Adam? Eddie's asking you, with a common name like Fisher, do people ever blow you off like, geesh, another Fisher, that he's related to everyone? People come to me all the time. Hey, are you related to that? No, because I know all of the descendants. I know all the branches, even the female branches and all that. There's an important point, though, in that question. There are much more common names than mine, but wouldn't you agree, David? There are a lot more ways to identify a person than just a name. I mean,
mm-hmm.
there's John Smith, the John Smith who was born in 1781, the one who was born in March 1781, who lived in Dutchess County, New York, the one who was a harness maker, the one who was married to Maria, the one who
Mm-hmm.
had these children, the one who died. There are so many identification points that you can really work on that can help you when you're dealing with common names. And we all have them.
Oh,
That's,
sure.
that's
I
why
mean,
they're
even my own
common.
last name is common. It means one who came by the bright land. And, like, I don't know, I think something said it was the 56th most common surname. So everyone asks, "Oh, are you a Lambert from this part of the country?" I'm like, no. I said, "There's only two of us in America that come in through my direct line, and then the other ones are in Canada." I mean, so
Yeah. And so you have to do those steps to kind of identify, do you have the right one? And that
mm-hmm.
is a challenge. But, you know, the question, you've done this before, just searching by first name only. You can do
Mm-hmm.
that now. That's one advantage that we have now on the internet and online that we never had in the old days. You couldn't search just by a first name. But
Well, I mean, exactly. I mean, for instance, with NEHCS, American Ancestors, 30 years ago when I worked at the State Archives, if you went and said you wanted to look up every Lambert death record, sure, I'd show you the indexes. But how about if you came to me and said, I want to find every woman who was a maiden name of Lambert? Well, you'd have to know her married name. Now,
right.
like, for instance, Mass Vital Records, I can go in on American Ancestors and plug in her maiden name in the first name field on a death search, and I come across every woman that has that as her maiden name. Of course, it comes with sometimes surnames can also be first names as well, so it can be occasionally tough. But
Yeah.
it's amazing how we can do this much easier now.
Yeah, absolutely. Another little thing that I've run into many times is people who switch their first and second name. So I'm actually William Scott, but my dad was William. So you couldn't have two Billies running around the house. So I was always Scott, And I remember in first grade, I thought I was Scott William. And
Oh,
so you see this in family Bible records a lot. The child is named, Ross Eldon. And then you get to the records and you find out, oh no, they're listed as Eldon R. Now what do? You've lost
my
the Ross. It's challenging.
My grandfather was James Albert George Lambert. Sometimes he was James, sometimes he was Albert, sometimes he was George. My father's George Richard Lambert. So when my grandfather had my father, he was going by George. So my father's name is Bud. I mean,
Wow. Well,
and
and
not
that
to mention where my name comes from, because that's a story for another show.
yeah, I know that story, and I
I
love
know
that
you
story.
do.
We'll save it. We talk about a lot of these things, many times on Extreme Genes and other places. But it's fun kind of to share some of those things. Adam says, should I start looking for immigration and/or ship logs to see if that is a generation that came to Mexico in reference to my fourth great grandfather? That is a good question. What do you say, David?
Well, I mean, Port of Mexico passenger list, it's something that I don't recall seeing on Ancestry.com, but I can tell you that FamilySearch.org has done a great deal of microfilming in Mexico,
Yes,
especially with church records.
and
So
getting better.
I would use the Family Search Wiki under Mexico and look at immigration and see what actually exists. That would be the best place to start first.
All right, good stuff. And Eddie has finally left us. He's called it I don't know where Eddie lives, but I'm sure it's in a land far away where it's very late. So it is getting late for everybody. Anyway, I'm not seeing any more questions right now, but I think we've gone a good long run here. I hope you enjoyed the Ask Me Anything. David, thank you so much for coming on and
Glad
lending.
to be via satellite simulcast for you
Yeah,
anytime, my
isn't
friend.
it great? I mean, we don't have to have a you needed a satellite to do this kind of stuff in the past. But first of all, I want to thank everybody who's been on for coming on and being a part of this. This is a whole new direction for us because frankly, we need to support the show if we're going to grow it. And I felt for a long time that radio is great for reaching out and introducing large swaths of the public. We're now on 55 radio stations. We just recently picked up Atlanta, Georgia, Rochester, New York. We're on twice in Dallas, twice in Phoenix. We're on in Salt Lake City, Utah. We're on in Las Vegas and many places all over the place. But this is a way I hope we can create a closer community. I'd like to interact more with you. I want to thank everybody for the faith in us to do this, and hopefully we meet your expectations of exactly what it is that you want. Um, and thank you, Adam. Adam says he went back and started listening to episode 1 of Extreme Genes. At this level, of course, you all get now the show a week early, and you get the bonus podcasts, and of course, you get all our love and affection for helping us to keep this ball rolling. We're 4 years along in this thing at this point. But if you could invite your friends, people who have a shared an interest to join us on Patreon, that would help us a lot. We appreciate that. Spread the word and feel free to reach out. Certainly to me, if you have anything, any question that's pressing, I'm happy to answer those things. And you can reach me at fisher@extremegenes.com. Gee, that's hard. And and if I don't know the answer, hopefully one of our experts, one of our expert friends of the show can help us and kind of go from there. But I think most of them we can kind of handle pretty well, David. Thanks so much to everybody. Have a good night, and we'll talk to you again next week. I promise it's not going to be this late all the time. We just had to work around David's schedule in Kentucky. He's on one side of the country, I'm on the other, and so it makes it a little bit complicated. Hopefully, if you miss it, you'll catch the replay of the show because it is all saved, of course, on Patreon. And we'll talk to you again. Take care. Thank you, David.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.